The wind came down from the bighorns with a mean spirit, carrying the first bite of a long winter and the grit of 1,000 barren miles. It scoured the single and dusty street of Bridger's Fork, a town that clung to the western edge of Wyoming like a stubborn burr on a saddle blanket. For Clara May Thompson, the wind was just another thing to be endured. It rattled the loose pane in the window of her small cookhouse and snaked through the cracks in the walls. But it could not touch the cold that had settled deep in her bones a year ago and never quite left. Her life was measured in scoops of flour and handfuls of beans, from before sunup until long after dark. She stood over a cast-iron stove. Her world shrunk to the hiss of frying bacon, the bubble of venison stew, and the low, hungry murmurs of the men she served. They were drifters, mostly, prospectors with hands stained by rock and eyes wild with fleeting hope, cowboys pushing gaunt cattle through unforgiving country, and the occasional weary traveler just trying to get from one place to the next without dying in between. They paid in coin when they had it, and with promises when they did not. Clara took both, because she had no other choice. After her husband, Robert, had been crushed in a silver mine collapse, the town's sympathy had lasted no longer than the dirt on the preacher's shovel. It soured quickly, curdling into something ugly and grasping. Robert had left behind nothing but his name and a ledger full of debts scrawled in the back of the general store. The whispers started soon after. They followed her down the street, quiet and sharp as snakebite. They said Robert had been a fool with his money, a drinker with a mean temper. They were not wrong, but then the whispers turned on her. The men who had once called Robert friend now looked at Clara with a different kind of gaze. It was a calculating look, an appraisal that made her skin crawl. It was the look of men who believed a debt was a debt, and if a widow could not pay in cash, there were other currencies. Mr. Abernathy, the storekeeper, would let his hand linger on hers when she paid for flour. A ranch hand named Silas would lean over the counter of her cookhouse, his breath smelling of whiskey and stale tobacco, and ask when she was going to stop mourning and remember what a woman was for. They saw her not as a grieving wife, but as an unclaimed property, an obligation waiting to be collected. Her safety was a thin sheet of ice over deep water, and she walked across it every day, praying it would hold. She learned to make her face a blank mask, to keep her eyes downcast, to make her voice flat and small. She moved through the town like a ghost, hoping that if she made herself insignificant enough, they might forget she existed. She sold what little she and Robert had owned, paid off what she could, and kept just enough to rent the one-room cabin at the very edge of town, where the sagebrush began its slow creep toward the mountains. The cabin was her refuge and her prison. During the day, it was a place of solitude, but at night, it became a cell filled with memories. The four walls held the echoes of Robert's heavy footsteps, the sharp crack of his voice, the dull, sickening thud of his fist against her ribs. He had not been a good man, and death had not made him one. She had mourned the man she thought she had married, a boy with a quick smile and promises of a good life. The man he became was a stranger she was forced to live with, a creature of bitterness and rage who chipped away at her spirit until there was almost nothing left. A year had passed, but the fear was still a living thing inside her. It woke her in the dead of night, a cold sweat slicking her skin, her body tensing for a blow that was no longer coming. She would lie there on her narrow cot, listening to the wind howl outside, her heart hammering against her ribs. She would touch the faint, faded shadow of a bruise on her arm, a ghost map of her marriage, and feel the phantom ache as if it were fresh. She never spoke of it, not to the preacher, not to the doctor, not to the few women in town who still offered her a tight-lipped nod. Shame was a heavy cloak, and she had learned to wear it so it would not show. The town saw a poor, unlucky widow. They did not see the woman who had prayed for the mining shaft to collapse, and then hated herself for the relief that washed over her when it did. On this particular evening, The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke with a vengeance. Rain came down in solid, slanting sheets, turning the dirt outside her cabin to thick, sucking mud. Thunder rolled across the sky, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small structure. Clara had finished her work for the day, cleaned the cookhouse, and trudged back to her cabin through the deluge. A thin shawl pulled tight over her head. Inside, a small fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the rough-hewn walls. It was her only companion. She sat on a low stool, staring into the flames, a bowl of leftover stew warming in her lap. The storm was a good excuse for solitude. No one would be out on a night like this. No one would come knocking. She could be alone with her ghosts, safe from the prying eyes and grasping hands of the living. That was when she heard it. A sound that did not belong to the storm. A heavy rhythmic thud against her door. Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, the spoon halfway to her mouth. It came again, louder this time. A fist, weak but insistent. Terror, cold and immediate, seized her. It could be anyone. Silas, drunk and emboldened by the storm. Mr. Abernathy, deciding to collect on a past-due bill. Her first instinct was to blow out the lamp, to retreat into the shadows and pretend she was not there. Let the storm take them. But then a different sound cut through the wind. A low groan, raw with pain. It was not the sound of a drunkard looking for trouble. It was the sound of a man at the end of his rope. Clara set her bowl down, her hands trembling. She was a woman who had spent years learning to survive by being invisible, by saying no, by barring her door against the world. Every instinct screamed at her to stay put. But the groan came again, weaker this time, followed by the heavy slump of a body against the wood. Something inside her, a stubborn ember of compassion she thought Robert had extinguished long ago, flickered to life. Cursing herself for a fool, she rose from the stool, her legs unsteady. She took a deep breath, her hand resting on the simple wooden bar that secured the door. She was alone. There was no one to call for, no one who would help her if this was a mistake. But the sound of that pain, it was a language she understood all too well. Slowly, she lifted the bar. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it open against the inside wall. And there, slumped on her doorstep, was the silhouette of a man. He was a heap of wet leather and denim, half-conscious, his face obscured by a mud-caked hat. Rainwater streamed from him, pooling on her floorboards. For a moment, she thought he was dead. Then he shifted, pushing himself up with one arm, his head lolling. "Please," he rasped, the words swallowed by a gust of wind. Clara stood paralyzed in the doorway, the cold rain spraying her face. She should have slammed the door. She should have run. But she looked at the way his body was slumped, the utter exhaustion in that single movement, and she knew he was no immediate threat to her. He was a threat only to himself. With a strength born of desperation, she grabbed him under the arms. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She grunted with the effort, dragging him across the threshold and out of the raging storm. She managed to heave the door shut, barring it again, sealing them inside together. The cabin was suddenly small, crowded, and thick with the smell of wet earth, soaked leather, and something else, something coppery and dark. Blood. She rolled him onto his back. The firelight fell across his face as his hat fell away. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 30 years old. His face was hard, etched with lines of sun and sorrow, and covered in several days' worth of dark stubble. A long scar, pale and silvery, cut across one eyebrow. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and ragged. His coat was soaked through. She fumbled with the buttons, her fingers clumsy and numb. When she pushed the wet fabric aside, she saw the source of the blood. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across the left side of his shirt, just below the ribs. It was a gunshot wound, fresh. Panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. A man with a gunshot wound did not just happen by. He was running from something, or someone. Bringing him in was bringing trouble over her doorstep. Trouble of a kind she could not even imagine. She should have left him outside. But it was too late now. He was here, and he was dying on her floor. She fetched a basin of water and tore strips from one of her few clean sheets. Her hands moved with a practiced efficiency she did not know she possessed. Years of tending to Robert's drunken injuries, the cuts and scrapes from his brawls, had taught her a thing or two, but this was different. This was a bullet. As she worked, gently cutting away the fabric of his shirt, he stirred. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, flickered open. They were cloudy with pain, but they were watchful. He did not speak, just watched her hands as she cleaned the wound. It was a nasty hole, bleeding sluggishly. The bullet seemed to have gone clean through, which was a small miracle. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time she had spoken to him. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He clenched his jaw, his knuckles turning white as she pressed a hot, wet cloth to the entry wound. But he did not make a sound. There was a hard stillness about him, an unnerving control even on the edge of unconsciousness. "My name is Clara," she said, needing to fill the silence, needing to make this situation feel somehow normal. He blinked slowly. His lips parted, and a dry, cracked sound came out. "Eli." Just the one word. He offered nothing more. No explanation for the bullet hole. No story of who he was or where he was going. He was just Eli, a wounded man on her floor. Clara finished cleaning the entry and exit wounds as best she could. She packed them with clean cloth and bound his ribs tightly. Her movements were gentle, careful. She was keenly aware of the solid muscle beneath his skin, the warmth of his body. It had been so long since she had touched a man with anything other than fear or duty. This felt different. It was a clinical act, an act of necessity. Yet it felt strangely intimate in the flickering firelight. Throughout it all, he never took his eyes off her, but his gaze held no judgment, no demand, none of the possessive fire she saw in the eyes of the townsmen. It was just watchful, guarded, as if he were trying to figure her out as much as she was trying to understand the situation she had dragged into her home. Oddly, his steady, silent presence was calming. He was a hurt animal, and she was tending to him. It was a simple, uncomplicated transaction. He needed help, and she was giving it. He did not ask for more. He did not touch her. He did not even thank her. He just accepted her care with a quiet, grim endurance that spoke of a life lived with pain. When she was done, she managed to help him to a sitting position, his back against the wall near the hearth where it was warmest. She ladled some of the stew into a bowl and held it out to him. He looked at the bowl, then back at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than pain in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or suspicion. He took the bowl with his good hand, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. Her breath hitched. The touch was nothing, a ghost of a contact, but it sent a jolt through her. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He ate slowly, methodically, without looking up. When he was finished, he set the empty bowl on the floor beside him. His eyelids began to droop, the exhaustion and blood loss finally pulling him under. "You can have the cot," she said softly. He shook his head, a small, stubborn gesture. "Floor's fine." His voice was a low rumble, rough with disuse. He slid down until he was lying on his side, his back to the room, facing the fire. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into the slow, even rhythm of sleep. Clara stood there for a long time, watching him. The firelight played over the strong lines of his back and shoulders. He was a big man, built of corded muscle and solid bone, Yet there was something profoundly broken about the way he slept. He looked less like a dangerous outlaw and more like a fallen giant. He had brought violence and uncertainty into her home, but as she watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, she felt none of the fear she had anticipated. Instead, she felt a hollow ache deep inside her. It was a feeling she recognized but could not name, a strange kinship with this wounded stranger. He was scarred. He was alone, just like her. She retreated to her cot, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. She did not sleep. For hours, she lay awake, listening to the twin sounds of the dying storm and the breathing of the man by her fire. She thought about the risk she had taken. The sheriff would not be pleased. The townspeople would be merciless if they found out. She had invited a wolf into her home, and she had no idea if he would bite. Yet, as she stared into the darkness, it was not fear that kept her awake. It was a fragile, unfamiliar flicker of something else, a feeling that for the first time in a very long time, she was not entirely alone in her brokenness. The storm passed before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and eerily silent. Clara rose before the first light, her body stiff from a night of restless half-sleep. The man, Eli, was still asleep by the hearth, a dark shape in the gray morning light. She moved quietly, adding a log to the embers of the fire and putting a pot of coffee on to boil. She needed to check on his horse. A man like that would not have gotten far on foot. She found the animal tethered in the small, rickety lean-to behind her cabin, where she kept her firewood dry. It was a fine-looking bay gelding, well-muscled but tired, its coat still damp from the storm. It had been ridden hard. She gave it water and a handful of oats she could not really spare, her hands stroking its neck. The horse was calm, well-mannered. It did not seem like the mount of a desperate criminal. A worn leather saddlebag was slung over the rail of the lean-to. Curiosity, sharp and undeniable, pricked at her. It was wrong to pry. It was dangerous, but the need to know who she was sheltering, what kind of trouble she had invited into her life, was stronger than her sense of propriety. Her hands trembled slightly as she unbuckled the stiff leather straps. Inside was what one might expect: a spare shirt, a whetstone, a small pouch of tobacco, and a half-eaten strip of jerky, but tucked into a side pocket, folded into a neat square, was a piece of paper. She pulled it out. The paper was coarse, cheap newsprint, and the image on it was stark and grainy. It was a wanted poster. Her blood ran cold. She had known, of course, but seeing it in black and white made it terrifyingly real. The poster was for a man named Frank Miller, wanted for cattle rustling and murder in the Colorado Territory. A $500 reward. Her eyes scanned the crudely drawn face, but it was not the face of the man sleeping by her fire. Then she saw it. Frank Miller's name had a thick, decisive line drawn through it in dark ink, and scrawled beneath it, in a different, rougher hand, was another name: Silas Blackwood. Clara stared at the poster, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was not just a wanted poster. It was a list, a hunting list. And the man in her cabin had already crossed one name off. He was not just running from the law. He was the law, of a kind. He was a man hunting other men, and now he was under her roof. She quickly folded the paper, shoved it back into the saddlebag, and backed away from the lean-to, her mind reeling. She had let a storm into her house, and she had no idea if she would survive the flood. The wanted poster felt like a hot coal in Clara's memory. All morning, as she went about her work in the cookhouse, the image of it was burned behind her eyes, the name crossed out, the new one scrawled beneath: Silas Blackwood. She served watery coffee and fried salt pork to a handful of sullen miners, her hands moving on their own while her mind churned. She was harboring a manhunter, a vigilante. He was not the common outlaw she had feared, but something else, something more dangerous perhaps, because his violence had a purpose. When she returned to the cabin at midday, a pot of thin soup in her hands. She found him awake. He was sitting on the floor by the hearth, his back straight, staring into the low-burning embers. He had folded the blanket she'd given him into a neat square and placed it at the foot of her cot. The sight of that small, orderly gesture was so unexpected it made her stop in the doorway. Robert had never folded a thing in his life. He left his clothes and his messes where they fell, for her to clean. Eli turned his head as she entered, his movements slow and deliberate, favoring his wounded side. His stormy gray eyes met hers, and for a moment, the air in the small room grew thick and still. He was a predator, she reminded herself, a man who hunted other men for a living. But his gaze held no menace. It was just quiet and tired, so deeply tired. "You should be resting," she said, her voice coming out sharper than she intended. She set the soup pot on the small, rickety table. "I've rested enough," he replied, his voice a low gravel. He pushed himself to his feet, using the stone mantel for support. A grimace of pain tightened his features, but he stifled the groan that rose in his throat. "Wound needs to be dressed." She nodded, her heart hammering a nervous beat against her ribs. She was alone with him. The door was barred. The town was a world away. She fetched the basin and fresh cloths, her hands moving with a mechanical steadiness she did not feel. He had already unbuttoned his shirt, exposing the crude bandage she had wrapped around his torso. He sat on the stool she offered, his silence filling the cabin. It was not an empty silence. It was heavy, watchful, and it made her skin prickle. As she unwrapped the old dressing, she tried to keep her eyes fixed on the task, but she was intensely aware of him. The breadth of his shoulders, the dark hair that dusted his chest, the tightly coiled muscle in his arms, scars, thin and white, crisscrossed his skin like faint trails on a map, telling stories she could not read. Her husband had been a big man, too, but his body had been soft with drink and idleness. Eli's was hard, honed by a life of hardship she could only guess at. The wound was clean, angry but not infected. As she worked, gently cleaning the edges, her fingers brushed against his warm skin. A jolt went through her, sharp and electric. She flinched, pulling her hand back for a split second before forcing it to be still. He must have felt it, but he gave no sign, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her, on the rough log wall of the cabin. "It's healing," she said, her voice a strained whisper. He grunted in response. She finished binding his ribs with a fresh strip of linen, her movements efficient, her touch as light as she could make it. When she was done, she stepped back, creating a space between them that felt both necessary and inadequate. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, the formal address sounding strange in the small cabin. He began to button his shirt. "You can't stay here," she said, the words rushing out before she could stop them. "The storm is over. You need to move on." He paused, his fingers still on a button, and looked at her. It was a long, appraising look that seemed to see right through the brave front she was trying to put up. He saw the fear in her eyes, the trembling in her hands. "I know," he said simply. "I'll be gone by morning. Just need one more night to get my strength." She nodded, unable to speak. Relief warred with a strange, unwelcome pang of disappointment. One more night. The day passed in that same, thick silence. Clara expected him to lie by the fire, to hoard what little strength he had. Instead, he moved about the small cabin with a restless energy. He found the source of the draft that always chilled her at night, a loose chink in the wall near the window, and spent an hour patiently stuffing it with scraps of cloth and mud until it was sealed. He noticed the wobble in one of the legs of her only chair and, using his belt knife and a piece of scrap wood, carved a small wedge to steady it. He did these things without a word, without asking permission. He simply saw a thing that was broken and fixed it. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye as she kneaded dough for the evening's bread. His quiet competence was more unsettling than any threat. Robert's presence in the cabin had been a loud, demanding thing, a force that took up all the air, that bent the space around him to his moods. Eli was the opposite. He seemed to fold himself into the small space, to make himself smaller so as not to impose. He never stood too close, never reached for anything at the same time she did, never moved in a way that might make her feel cornered. He was respectful of her space, of her silence, in a way that she found profoundly confusing. Cruelty. She understood. She knew its rules, its patterns. She had learned how to survive it. This quiet, unassuming gentleness was foreign territory. It had no rules, and it left her feeling exposed and uncertain. That evening, they ate in silence, seated on opposite sides of the hearth. The fire crackled between them, a small, warm world in the vast, cold dark. The bread she had baked was dense and warm, and the stew was thin, but it was hot, for the first time. Clara felt the sharp edge of her loneliness not as a constant, dull ache, but as an awareness of the person sitting across from her. The silence was not empty tonight. It was shared. She found herself speaking before she even knew she was going to. "My husband, Robert," she began, her voice small and tight. "He died in the silver mine, a year ago last month." Eli did not look up from his bowl, but she saw his hands still. He did not offer condolences or empty platitudes like the townsfolk had. He just listened, his silence an invitation to continue if she wished. "The town, they think he left me well off," she continued, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "He didn't. He left nothing but bills at the general store." She let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded like a stone dropping into a well. "This cabin isn't even mine. I pay rent on it every month." She did not know why she was telling him this. It was a secret she held close, a shame she guarded fiercely. But something about his quiet presence made the words feel safe. He was a transient, a ghost passing through. Her secrets would leave with him in the morning. "It gets lonely," she whispered, the words so soft she was not sure she had said them aloud. "Sometimes, at night, the quiet is so loud it feels like screaming. I sit here by the fire and I try to remember how to cry, but I can't." She finally risked a glance at him. He had set his bowl aside and was looking at her now. His face was cast in shadow and firelight, his expression unreadable, but there was no pity in his eyes. Pity was what the preacher's wife gave her, a soft, cloying thing that made her feel small and pathetic. Eli's gaze was different. It was direct, steady. It was the look of a man who understood that some wounds were too deep for tears. He said nothing, and she was grateful for it. There was nothing to say. She had not spoken for comfort. She had spoken, she realized, simply to hear the truth of her own life said out loud in the presence of another human being. They sat like that for a long time as the fire burned down to glowing coals. The warmth, the shared meal, the fragile confession hanging in the air between them. It all combined to create a strange sense of peace, a temporary truce with the world outside her door. The space between them seemed to shrink, the shadows drawing them closer until their knees were almost touching. Clara stared into the embers, her thoughts drifting. She was so lost in the flickering light that she did not notice she had leaned forward until her hand, resting on the rough stone of the hearth, brushed against his. The contact was like a lightning strike. Heat flared up her arm, straight to her chest, where it bloomed into a wild, terrifying panic. She snatched her hand back as if the hearthstone were red hot. Her breath caught in her throat, and she could feel a tremor starting deep inside her. It was not fear. That was the most terrifying part. With Robert, an accidental touch would have sent a spike of pure animal fear through her, a bracing for the inevitable anger, the blow that might follow. This was different. This was a deep, shuddering tremor of something else. Something she had not felt in so long she no longer had a name for it. It was a raw, aching longing that was so powerful it frightened her more than any fist ever had. It was the feeling of a parched and barren land suddenly sensing the distant promise of rain. She could not look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the fire, her heart hammering against her ribs. Convinced he could hear it, she felt stripped bare, her desperate loneliness exposed in that one reflexive jerk of her hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the fire. "Nothing to be sorry for," he said, his voice low and even. After another long moment of strained silence, he spoke again. "I was in a range war, down in the Tonto Basin, cattlemen against homesteaders." He paused, and she could feel his gaze on her, even though she refused to meet it. "My family. We had a small ranch. Wasn't much, but it was ours. My younger brother, James. He was all I had left." He shifted, the leather of his gun belt creaking softly. "The cattlemen hired guns to push us out, men who liked their work too much. There was a fire. James, he didn't make it out." The story was delivered in a flat, emotionless tone, but Clara could hear the jagged edges of grief beneath the surface. She finally forced herself to look at him. His jaw was tight, his gaze distant, lost in a memory of smoke and blood. "I'm tracking the man who set the fire," he said, his voice dropping lower, harder. "The one who gave the order, a man named Silas Blackwood. The name from the poster. It landed in the quiet cabin with the weight of a coffin lid. So that was it, not bounty. Vengeance, a debt of blood that he intended to collect." She saw the crossed-out name in her mind and understood. This was a man who finished what he started. She looked at this wounded, grim-faced man, a man driven by a ghost, and she felt that strange kinship again, stronger than before. They were both haunted. They were both living in the wreckage of a life that had been burned to the ground. As the silence stretched on, she became aware of his gaze on her again. It was no longer distant, but focused, intense. His eyes roamed her face, then drifted lower, to her collar, where the top button of her dress was undone. She instinctively raised a hand to her throat, a flush of heat creeping up her neck, but he was not looking there. His eyes were fixed on a spot on her upper arm, just below the sleeve of her dress. She followed his gaze. A faint, yellowish-green shadow marred her skin there, the last remnant of a bruise Robert had given her weeks before he died, when she had been too slow to bring him his whiskey. It was a ghost of a hurt, barely visible in the dim light, but he had seen it. His expression changed. It was a subtle shift, a hardening around his eyes, a tightening of his jaw, but it was profound. He did not ask. He did not need to. He looked from the fading bruise on her arm back to her face, and in his eyes, she saw not just understanding, but a cold, quiet rage that was not directed at her. It was a rage on her behalf. In that single, silent glance, he saw the unspoken story of her marriage, the truth she had hidden from the whole world, and he did not flinch. He did not turn away. He simply saw it, and accepted it, and hated it. Something inside her, a knot of shame and fear she had carried for years, began to loosen, to be seen, truly seen, without judgment or pity. It was a powerful and terrifying thing. He rose slowly to his feet. "You should get some sleep, Clara," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He moved to his spot by the fire, lay down on the hard floor, and turned his back to her, giving her the illusion of privacy. That night, Clara did not lie awake listening for footsteps that no longer came. When sleep finally took her, it was deep and dream-filled. She dreamt she was standing by a fire, its light warm and golden on her skin. A hand reached for hers, and she did not pull away. The touch was gentle, the fingers slowly lacing through hers, holding on as if she were something precious. The dream shifted, and a face leaned close to hers, a face she could not quite see but knew she did not fear. A mouth hovered over hers, patient, waiting. It did not take. It waited for her to lean in. It was a dream of firelight, of touch that did not hurt, of a kiss that was a question instead of a demand. She woke just before dawn with the phantom feeling of warmth still on her lips, and the quiet, steady sound of Eli's breathing filling the darkness. He did not leave the next morning, nor the morning after that. The unspoken pretense was his wound. It was still raw, and the long ride ahead required a man to be at his full strength. Clara did not press him. Each morning she would wake to find he was already up, the fire rekindled, a bucket of fresh water brought from the well. He would nod a quiet good morning, and then retreat into his watchful silence. A fragile, unspoken rhythm began to settle between them in the small cabin. It was a shared solitude, a quiet dance of two people learning the shape of the other's loneliness. But a secret cannot be kept for long in a place as small and hungry for gossip as Bridger's Fork. The town was a web of intersecting gazes, and Clara had been at the center of its most judgmental strands for a year. The first thread of the news story was spun by Martha Gable, a woman whose piety was matched only by the sharpness of her tongue. Her small, tidy house sat on a slight rise of land that gave her a perfect view of Clara's cabin. One morning, just after dawn, Martha was shaking out a rug on her porch when she saw him. Eli was standing by Clara's woodpile, the axe rising and falling with a steady, powerful rhythm that sent clean, white chips of wood flying. He was bare to the waist, his bandaged torso a stark slash of white against his sun-darkened skin. He moved with an easy strength that was both impressive and, in Martha's eyes, deeply improper. She watched him for a full minute, her lips pursed into a thin, bloodless line. Then she went inside, her mind already composing the whispers she would share over the counter at the general store. The change in the town was not immediate, but it was palpable. It was a subtle chilling of the air around Clara. The nods she received on the street became curt, the eyes that met hers colder, sliding away too quickly. When she went to the cookhouse, the few women who still spoke to her suddenly found their hands too busy to wave a greeting. The whispers that had once been about her husband's debts now had a new, sharper edge. They spoke of the widow's shame, of her taking in strange men, of the sounds of an axe at dawn. They painted her loneliness not as a tragedy, but as a moral failing, an open door for sin to enter. Clara felt their judgment like a physical weight. It pressed on her shoulders, bent her head, and made it hard to breathe. She had lived with their scorn for a year, but this was different. This was not about her husband's failures. This was about hers. And it was a lie. A twisted version of the truth that was somehow more painful than a simple falsehood. A few days after Martha Gable's sighting, their supplies ran low. They needed flour, coffee, and salt. When Clara prepared to go into town, a small, worn purse clutched in her hand. Eli stood up from his place by the fire. "I'll go with you," he said. It was not a question. Panic seized her. "No, you cannot. They will see you." "They have already seen me," he said, his voice flat. "Let them see me again." He looked at her, his gray eyes steady. "You should not have to face them alone." She wanted to argue, to tell him that his presence would only make it worse, that he did not understand the venom of small-town gossip. But she was tired of being alone. The thought of walking down that dusty street with him beside her, a solid, silent presence, sent a treacherous flicker of strength through her. She gave a small, defeated nod. The walk into town was an ordeal. Every curtain seemed to twitch as they passed. Men stopped their conversations on the boardwalk to stare. Women pulled their children a little closer. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the muddy ground in front of her, her face burning with a shame she did not deserve. Eli walked beside her, his expression unreadable, his gaze sweeping over the town with a cool, assessing stillness that seemed to miss nothing. He did not touch her, but she was aware of him with every fiber of her being, a shield of warmth and quiet strength at her side. The bell above the door of Abernathy's general store tinkled, announcing their arrival. The store was empty save for Mr. Abernathy himself, a portly man with small, shrewd eyes and a damp-looking mustache. He was polishing the counter with a dirty rag, and he looked up as they entered, a slow, unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "Clara," he said, his voice oozing a false familiarity. His eyes flicked from her to Eli, taking in the stranger's worn clothes, the gun on his hip, and the hard set of his jaw. The smile widened. "See, you are entertaining visitors now. Times must be hard indeed." Clara flinched as if struck. The insinuation was as foul as the stale cigar smoke that clung to the store's shelves. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "We need flour," Eli said, his voice dangerously low. "And coffee." Abernathy's gaze slid back to Eli, full of smug challenge. "Is that so? And are you paying with cash, or is this going on the widow's account, the one her husband left behind?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial sneer. "I do hope he is paying you better than Robert's credit ever did." "Clara." It happened faster than Clara could follow. One moment, Eli was standing by the door. The next, he had crossed the space between them in 2 long strides. He reached across the counter, his hand grabbing a fistful of Abernathy's shirt front, and hauled the bigger man halfway over the polished wood. Sacks of beans and tins of peaches tumbled to the floor with a crash. Abernathy's face went from smug to terrified, his complexion turning the color of old dough. "You will apologize to the lady," Eli growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. It was the sound of rocks grinding together, of a storm about to break. "Eli, no!" Clara cried out, rushing forward. She grabbed his arm, her small hands barely encircling his bicep. It was like grabbing hold of an oak tree. "Please, do not. He is not worth it." For a second, she thought he would not listen. She could feel the violent tension coiled in his muscles, the cold fury radiating from him. His knuckles were white where he gripped Abernathy's shirt. But then he looked down at her pale, frightened face and her desperate eyes. Something in his expression shifted. The murderous rage receded, replaced by that same grim control she had seen before. With a final, contemptuous shove, he released Abernathy, who stumbled backward, collapsing against a barrel of pickles. Eli stood there for a moment, his chest rising and falling, his gaze promising a violence he had only postponed. Then he turned, took Clara by the elbow, and guided her out of the store, leaving their needed supplies and Abernathy's stunned silence behind them. The walk back to the cabin was silent and fraught with tension. Clara's heart was still racing. She was terrified, but she was also shaken by the raw, protective power she had just witnessed. No one had ever defended her. Robert had been the source of her humiliation, not its shield. As soon as the cabin door was shut behind them, the storm broke between them. "You have to leave," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. She turned to face him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You must see that now. Look what you have done. You have made everything worse." "That man insulted you," Eli said, his voice still tight with suppressed rage. "And you think threatening to beat him to death in the middle of his own store makes it better?" She shot back, her voice rising. "They will call the sheriff. They will run you out of town. Or worse. And what do you think will happen to me after that? After they all saw you defend my honor?" She spat the word out as if it tasted foul. "You have put a target on my back. I will not let men like that speak to you in such a way." "You will not be here to stop them," she cried, tears of frustration finally welling in her eyes. "You will be gone, and I will be the one left here to face the consequences. I am begging you, Eli, please, for my sake, leave this place. Ride out now, before more trouble finds us." He stood there, watching her, his face a hard mask. She expected him to argue, to defend his actions. Instead, he just looked at her, his gaze holding a deep, painful sorrow. "I cannot," he said quietly. "Why?" she demanded. "Why can you not just go?" He took a step closer, his eyes boring into hers. "Because I have left too many things unfinished in my life," he said, his voice low and intense. "I have run from too many fires. I will not run from this one." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with a meaning that went far beyond the squalid little scene in the general store. He was not just talking about Abernathy. He was talking about her. He would not abandon her to the mess he had helped create. Clara stared at him, her anger draining away, replaced by a wave of dizzying, terrifying emotion. She was ashamed of the scene in the store, of the looks, of the whispers. She was scared of what the town would do, of what the sheriff might do. But as she looked at Eli's grim, determined face, she realized with a sickening lurch that there was one thing she feared more than anything else. She was more afraid of him leaving than she was of him staying. She was more afraid of being left alone again in the screaming silence of her life than she was of the trouble he would surely bring. The realization left her breathless and weak. She turned away from him, unable to let him see the desperate conflict in her eyes. The trouble, as she knew it would, found them the next day. It came in the form of Sheriff Brody, a tall, stoop-shouldered man with a weary face and a tin star pinned crookedly to his vest. He rode up to the cabin alone, dismounting with the slow, stiff movements of a man whose bones ached. Eli had seen him coming from the window and had melted into the shadows at the back of the cabin without a word. Clara met the sheriff on her doorstep, wiping her damp hands on her apron, her heart a cold stone in her chest. "Afternoon, Clara," Sheriff Brody said, touching the brim of his hat. His eyes were kind, but they held a professional weight that made her nervous. "Mind if I have a word?" "I am busy, Sheriff." "This will not take long," he said, his gaze sweeping past her, into the dim interior of the cabin. "I have had some reports, talk around town, about a stranger staying with you." Clara's blood ran cold. "I do not know what you mean." The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. "Clara, do not make this harder than it needs to be. Abernathy came to me yesterday, full of stories about a man who nearly tore his head off, a man folks have seen coming and going from this cabin, a man fitting the description of someone wanted for questioning about a shooting up near the pass." He lowered his voice, his expression turning serious. "There is a bounty on a man named Eli, $500. Some folks get awful brave for that kind of money. I do not want to see you get caught in the middle of something ugly. Harboring a wanted man is a serious crime. It could lead to jail, or worse." He let the words hang in the air for a moment. "Tell him to move on. Clara, for his own good, and for yours." He tipped his hat again, turned without waiting for a reply, and rode away, leaving Clara standing on her doorstep, the world seeming to tilt beneath her feet. She closed the door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely slide the bar into place. Eli stepped out of the shadows, his face grim. "You heard?" she whispered. He nodded. "A bounty," she said, her voice cracking. "He said there is a bounty on you. You are a wanted man." She looked at him, all the fear and confusion of the past week boiling over into a single, desperate demand. "You have to tell me the truth, all of it. I will not live with the whispers and the threats and the lies for one moment longer. Who are you, Eli?" He looked at her for a long moment, a battle raging in his eyes. Then he seemed to come to a decision. He gestured to the stool by the fire. "Sit down, Clara." She did as he asked, her legs threatening to give out from under her. He remained standing, pacing the small space in front of the hearth like a caged animal. "I am not the man the sheriff thinks I am," he began, his voice low. "I am not a common criminal. The man I am hunting, Silas Blackwood. He was a lawman, a deputy marshal." Clara stared at him, uncomprehending. "He worked for a cattle baron down in the Tonto Basin," Eli continued, his voice hardening with the memory. "His job was to run the homesteaders off their land so the baron could have the water rights. He used his badge as a shield. He would burn folks out, claim they were rustlers, and shoot anyone who fought back. The law looked the other way. He burned my family's ranch. He murdered my brother." He stopped pacing and looked directly at her, his eyes blazing with a cold, righteous fire. "I went to the law. I told them what he did. They called me a liar. They said my brother died in an accident. They told me to move on. So I did. I moved on to hunting Blackwood myself. The man on that poster, Frank Miller, he was one of Blackwood's hired guns. He was there the night of the fire. I got him to tell me where Blackwood was headed before he died. The bounty on my head was put there by Blackwood's friends, to stop me from finding him. They have twisted the story to make me the outlaw. So yes, Clara, I am a wanted man, but I am not a criminal." The story settled over the room, stark and brutal and full of a grief so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the cabin. She finally understood the weight he carried, the ghosts that drove him. He was a man who had lost everything, a man who had been failed by the very laws that were meant to protect him. His raw, painful honesty demanded the same from her. All the secrets she had held in the dark, all the shame that had kept her silent, suddenly felt like a cowardice she could no longer bear. "My husband," she began, her voice a raw whisper. "Robert, he did not just have a temper." She took a shuddering breath, forcing herself to meet Eli's gaze. "He was a cruel man. The night before he died, he was drunk. He was angry because I had not mended his shirt properly. He hit me." She touched her side, the memory, a phantom pain. "He hit me so hard he cracked 2 of my ribs. I could not breathe without crying out for a week." She paused, the darkest secret of all pushing to get out. "When they told me about the mine collapse," she said, tears streaming down her face now, hot and silent. "When they told me he was dead, I did not feel grief. Eli, I felt relief. I fell to my knees and I thanked God he was gone. For months before that, I had gone to bed every single night, and I had prayed for him to die." The confession, spoken aloud for the first time, left her feeling hollowed out, utterly exposed. She waited for the look of disgust, of judgment. She had wished her own husband dead. But Eli did not look away. He crossed the space between them and knelt in front of her. The firelight flickered across his face, illuminating an expression of profound, aching sorrow. Not for himself, for her. That night, after the unspoken truths had been laid bare between them, the last wall separating them crumbled to dust. They sat by the fire, the silence no longer tense or awkward, but full of a deep, shared understanding. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment in the air between them before he slowly, gently, touched her cheek. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. She closed her eyes and leaned into his touch. A silent surrender. His hand was calloused and rough, but his touch was the gentlest thing she had ever known. It was not a touch of hunger or demand. It was a touch of reverence, as if he were handling something sacred and infinitely precious. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, his thumb stroking away a tear she had not realized had fallen. She opened her eyes and looked at him, in the warm, flickering firelight. She saw her own pain reflected in his gaze. He understood. He saw all of her, the fear, the shame, the ugliness she had hidden for so long, and he was not afraid. A sob broke from her lips, a raw, wrenching sound torn from the deepest part of her soul. The tears she had been unable to shed for a year came in a great, cleansing flood. She wept for her lost youth, for the love that had turned to poison, for the years of silent suffering. She wept for the woman she might have been. Eli pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. He did not speak. He just held her, his hand stroking her hair, his solid presence a safe harbor in the storm of her grief. He held her as she wept, and he did not let go. The night of their shared confessions left an indelible mark on the small cabin. A fragile, shimmering thing had been born in the space between them. A trust so new and delicate that neither dared to name it. The silence that fell was no longer one of caution, but of comfort. They moved around each other with a new, quiet awareness. The air charged not with tension, but with the profound relief of two people who had finally been seen. But the sanctuary of the four log walls was a world apart from Bridger's Fork, and the town had a long memory and a cruel tongue. The coldness that had been a subtle chill now became a bitter frost. When Clara walked into Abernathy's general store 2 days later, a desperate hope in her heart that the incident had been forgotten, she was met with a wall of implacable silence. Mr. Abernathy was measuring out grain for another customer, and he did not so much as lift his eyes when the bell on the door announced her presence. She waited patiently by the counter, her small list of necessities clutched in her hand, until the other customer had paid and left. She stood alone in the quiet, dusty store. Mr. Abernathy continued his work, meticulously sweeping a few spilled grains into a dustpan. His back turned to her. "Mr. Abernathy?" she said, her voice small. He did not turn. "We are out of what you need." "You do not even know what I need," she replied, a faint tremor in her voice. "I just need a little flour and some salt." He finally turned, his face a mask of smug righteousness. "I said, we are out. Now, if you do not mind, I have inventory to attend to." He turned his back on her again, a deliberate and final dismissal. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that started at her neck and spread across her face. She knew he was lying. She could see the sacks of flour stacked against the far wall. She stood there for a long moment, frozen, before turning and walking out, the bell on the door sounding a mocking farewell. Sunday was worse. For the first time in months, she felt a need for the solace of the church, a longing to sit in the quiet of the pews and feel a part of something larger than her own small, troubled life. She put on her best dress, a faded gray calico, and walked into town, leaving Eli behind with a warning to stay out of sight. As she entered the small, whitewashed church, a wave of whispers rippled through the congregation. It was like watching the wind move through a field of dry grass. Heads turned, then quickly turned away. Women leaned in to speak to their husbands behind gloved hands. As she made her way to an empty pew at the back, Mrs. Gable, the woman who had first seen Eli, pointedly gathered the folds of her skirt as Clara passed, as if to protect it from contamination. The preacher's sermon was on the wages of sin, and his eyes seemed to find hers again and again. His words about fallen women and the company they keep feeling like stones being thrown directly at her. She sat through the service with her back straight and her eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross at the front of the church. But she felt nothing of God's grace. She felt only the cold, hard judgment of her neighbors. She left before the final hymn, unable to bear it a moment longer. She fled back to the cabin, the one place she felt safe. As she burst through the door, her composure finally crumbling, she found Eli sitting at the table, patiently mending a strap on his saddlebag. He looked up, and the hard lines of his face softened as he saw the raw distress in her eyes. He did not ask what had happened. He did not need to. He simply stood, took the worn shawl from her shoulders, and led her to the stool by the hearth. He poured her a cup of water, his movements sure and steady, a silent, comforting presence that grounded her. In that moment, Clara knew that the solace she had sought in the house of God, she had found here, in a one-room cabin with a wanted man. Despite knowing he had to leave, that his presence was a danger to them both, Eli began to put down tentative roots in the barren patch of land around her cabin. It started with him clearing the thick, thorny brush that choked the area behind the house, his axe swinging with a tireless rhythm. He was a man who could not be idle, a man who needed to build and mend. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, his efforts slowly carving out a small patch of order from the wilderness. One afternoon, he came back from a ride in the hills, not with game, but with a crudely made crate tied to the back of his saddle. Inside were 4 scrawny, rust-colored hens, which he had traded a silver dollar for with a homesteader who lived miles away. "Every place needs a little life," was all he said. He spent the next 2 days building a small, sturdy pen for them near the woodpile. He used scrap lumber he found and scavenged, his hands working with a skill that surprised her. He built a small roost and nesting boxes, his attention to detail absolute. Clara watched him from the doorway, a painful lump forming in her throat. He was building a home he would never live in, creating a future he would never be a part of. The cheerful clucking of the hens was both a comfort and a constant, heartbreaking reminder of the temporary nature of their time together. In these small pockets of peace, sealed off from the hostile world outside, they found a fragile happiness. They fell into a routine that felt blessedly normal. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and sometimes he would talk. He spoke of the ranch he had grown up on, of the smell of the pines after a rain, of the way his brother James could make a horse do anything with just a soft word. He spoke of his past not with self-pity, but with a quiet, aching nostalgia that made her own losses feel less solitary. They found laughter in the smallest of things. One evening, sharing one of the last of her winter apples, she told him about a time she had tried to bake a pie for the town social and had used salt instead of sugar. The memory, once a source of deep embarrassment, became funny in the telling. Eli's lips, which she had only ever seen set in a hard, grim line, quirked into a rare, genuine smile. The sight of it was so unexpected, so beautiful, that it made her heart skip a beat. Sometimes he would read to her from scraps of old newspaper he had in his saddlebag. His voice was a low, steady rumble, and she would close her eyes and listen, the words themselves less important than the simple, domestic comfort of the sound. They would sit on the small stoop in the late afternoon sun and watch a lone hawk circle high above the ridge, its wings spread wide against the vast, blue canvas of the sky. In those moments, watching the free, wild creature, they could almost believe that they were free, too. They were just a man and a woman, living a quiet life, the rest of the world and its troubles 1,000 miles away. But the world was not 1,000 miles away. It was just down the dusty track, and it was coming for them. It happened on a bright, cold afternoon. A telegram had arrived at the station in Bridger's Fork. It had come from a marshal in the Colorado Territory, a friend of Silas Blackwood, and it offered a detailed description of Eli and confirmed the $500 bounty on his head for the murder of Frank Miller, for Sheriff Brody. The telegram changed everything. This was no longer a local dispute or town gossip. This was official business. Clara and Eli were outside, feeding the chickens, when they saw the 3 riders approaching. Sheriff Brody was in the lead, flanked by 2 grim-faced men Clara recognized as deputies. There was a finality in the way they rode, their horses moving at a slow, deliberate walk, their hands resting near the guns on their hips. Eli saw them and froze. The small bucket of feed slipped from his hand, spilling across the dirt. He looked at Clara, and in his eyes, she saw a weary, hunted look that broke her heart. All the peace, all the fragile joy of the past weeks, evaporated in an instant. "Go inside, Clara," he said, his voice low and urgent. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She moved to stand beside him. "I will not." He did not have time to argue. The riders had reached the edge of the cleared land and pulled their horses to a halt. "Eli," Sheriff Brody called out, his voice flat and official. "I have a warrant for your arrest, for the murder of Frank Miller." Eli did not move. His hand did not go to his gun. He simply stood there, his shoulders slumped, as if a great weight had finally settled upon him. "There is no need for that. Sheriff, I am not going to fight you." The deputies dismounted, their guns drawn, and advanced on him cautiously. Clara wanted to scream, to throw herself in front of him, but she was paralyzed by a cold, numbing dread. They took his gun, bound his hands behind his back with a rough piece of rope, and pushed him toward one of the horses. Clara ran forward, her paralysis breaking. "Sheriff, please, you do not understand. He is not a murderer. He was defending himself." Sheriff Brody would not meet her eyes. He looked tired, older than he had just a few days ago. "That is for a judge to decide. Clara, not me." He looked at her then, his gaze hard. "You should have listened to me. You should have sent him on his way." They mounted up, with Eli tied and slumped in his saddle, and rode away without a backward glance. Clara was left standing alone in the sudden, deafening silence. The spilled chicken feed at her feet the only evidence that the peaceful moment they had shared had ever existed at all. She did not hesitate. She ran into the cabin, her mind racing. She pulled out the small, cloth-wrapped bundle from beneath a loose floorboard where she kept her meager savings. It was not much. A few silver dollars, some smaller coins. It was every spare cent she had scraped together over the past year. It was the money she had saved for taxes, for a harsh winter, for a day when she might finally be able to leave this place. She clutched the small, heavy bundle in her hand and ran. She ran all the way into town, not stopping until she was breathless and half sobbing, standing in the dusty confines of the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was sitting behind his desk, filling out paperwork. He looked up as she burst in. "Please," she gasped, placing the small bundle of money on his desk. "Take it. It is all I have. Please, just let him go. Let him ride out. No one has to know." The sheriff looked at the pathetic pile of coins, then back at her, and his weary face hardened into an expression of pure scorn. He pushed the money back toward her with the tip of his finger. "Justice is not for sale in this town, Clara," he said, his voice cold and sharp with contempt. "Especially not to a woman of your reputation. Now get out of my office." His words were a slap in the face, more brutal than any physical blow. He had not just rejected her money, he had rejected her, dismissed her as a person whose pleas were worth less than nothing. She stumbled out of the office, the coins feeling like stones in her hand, her last hope extinguished. She insisted on seeing Eli. The jail was a small, foul-smelling stone building attached to the sheriff's office. There were only 2 cells. Eli was in one of them. He was sitting on a narrow cot, his back against the stone wall. They had worked him over. His face was bruised and swollen, and a cut on his lip was bleeding sluggishly. He looked up as she approached the bars, and the sight of his broken, spiritless eyes was almost more than she could bear. "You should not be here," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I am not leaving you," she said, her hands gripping the cold iron bars. "We will fight this. I will tell them the truth. I will tell them everything you told me." He shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound and utter weariness. "No, Clara, let it go." He looked at his hands, then back up at her, and she saw a man who had reached the end of his rope. "I am tired of blood. It has followed me my whole life. I am tired of fighting. Maybe this is just how it ends." He was giving up. The town, the law, his past, it had all finally beaten him down. She looked at his defeated face, and a fire ignited inside her, a fierce, protective rage that burned away all her fear. They had taken everything from her. They had taken her husband, her good name, her place in the community. She would not let them take this. She would not let them kill the one small flicker of light that had found its way into her dark life. "No," she said, her voice low and trembling with a strength she did not know she possessed. "I will not let it end like this. They will not have you." She left the jail and walked not back to her cabin, but toward the other end of town, where the houses were larger and set back from the street. She walked with a purpose she had not felt in years. She knew there was only one person who might be able to help, one person who understood the law and who might, just might, be moved by the truth. She stopped in front of the neat 2-story home of Judge Alistair Finch. He was a retired circuit judge, an old friend of her husband's family. He was a stern, formidable man who had built his life on the rigid principles of the law. After Robert's death, he had offered her his condolences in a stiff, formal letter, and had then proceeded to ignore her existence, turning his back on her just like the rest of the town, swallowing her pride, which felt like swallowing shards of glass. She walked up the stone path and knocked on his front door. An elderly housekeeper showed her into a dark, book-lined study. Judge Finch was sitting in a large leather chair behind a massive oak desk. He was a man in his late 60s, with a mane of white hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to dissect everything they looked at. He did not rise. "Clara," he said, his voice dry as dust. "This is an unexpected visit." "I need your help, Judge," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I am retired," he said dismissively. "I no longer practice law." "This is not about the law," she said, taking a step closer to his desk. "This is about justice." She told him everything. She told him about Eli, about his brother, about the corrupt deputy marshal named Silas Blackwood. She spoke with a desperate, passionate clarity, her words tumbling over one another. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When she was finished, he was silent for a long moment. "You are asking me to believe the word of a wanted man, a man accused of murder, over the word of the law," he finally said. "You are asking me to risk my reputation on the story of a drifter you have taken into your home. I am asking you to look at the evidence," she said, her courage surging. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the folded, worn piece of paper she had taken from Eli's saddlebag after his arrest. She unfolded the wanted poster and laid it on his desk. "His name is Eli. The man on this poster is Frank Miller. His name is crossed out. Eli was hunting him on behalf of his family, not for a bounty. The name below it is Silas Blackwood. This is not the work of a common outlaw. This is the work of a man seeking justice the law has denied him." The judge stared at the poster. He picked it up, his sharp eyes examining the crossed-out name, the roughly scrawled one beneath it. She could see a flicker of something in his eyes, the old, ingrained curiosity of a man who had spent his life sifting through lies to find the truth. "You were a friend to Robert's father," Clara pressed on, her voice soft but insistent. "You are a man who has devoted his life to the idea of the law. Is this law? To let a good man hang while a murderer hides behind a badge?" He looked from the poster to her face, and for the first time, he did not see the pathetic, shamed widow of a failed miner. He saw a woman fighting with every ounce of her being for a man's life. He saw a strength and a conviction he had not expected. The social cost to her was enormous. By coming to him, by publicly aligning herself with this outlaw, she was burning the last bridge that connected her to the town's good graces. She was making herself a complete pariah, and she was doing it willingly. He was silent for a very long time. Then, with a deep sigh that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul, he nodded slowly. "Leave the poster with me," he said, his voice gruff. "I will look into it. I make no promises, Clara, but I will look." It was not a victory, not yet, but it was a beginning. It was a sliver of light in the overwhelming darkness. As Clara left the judge's house and walked back toward her empty cabin, she knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time in her life, she was not just enduring, she was fighting back. Judge Finch was a man of his word, and his word still carried the weight of iron in the Wyoming territory. He did not work miracles, but he worked the law. He sent telegrams, called in old favors, and presented a case to the circuit prosecutor that was built not on emotion, but on a cold, irrefutable logic that hinted at a deeper corruption. The bounty was rescinded, the murder charge reduced to a lesser count of assault to be investigated further, and after 3 long days in the suffocating silence of his cell, Eli was released. He walked out into the harsh afternoon sun not as a free man, but as a man untethered. The bruises on his face had begun to fade to a sickly yellow, but the beating had left a deeper mark on his spirit. He was quieter, his shoulders carrying a new and heavier slump. The fight had gone out of him, leaving behind a hollow, brittle emptiness. Clara was waiting for him outside the sheriff's office. Her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The moment she saw him, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over her. She rushed to him, her hand reaching for his arm. He flinched away from her touch. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it hit her with the force of a physical blow. He stopped and looked at her, and his eyes, once so full of a fierce, quiet intensity, were now dull and lifeless. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the bottom of the well and found nothing there. "You should not have done that," he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "I was not going to let them keep you," she replied, her own voice trembling. "You have ruined yourself, Clara," he said, and there was no anger in his voice, only a profound and devastating sorrow. "For me, look what I have brought you, scorn, humiliation. I am poison to you." He would not let her walk beside him. He insisted on walking a few paces behind her as they made their way back to the cabin, as if he were her shadow, a thing of darkness she could not shake. The town watched them go, their faces cold and hard as granite. Clara held her head high, but she could feel their hatred like a physical force, pressing in on her from all sides. They had lost their bounty, their simple, violent solution, and they would not forgive her for it. The cabin, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Eli would not speak, would not meet her eyes. He sat by the cold hearth, staring at the ashes, lost in a darkness she could not penetrate. He was a ghost in her home, his presence a constant, aching reminder of what her stand had cost them both. He believed there was no future for a man like him, a man haunted by blood and violence, and he could not see a future for her as long as she was tied to him. He was convinced the only kindness he could show her was to leave, but he was too broken, too weary, to even summon the strength for that. Clara felt her own strength beginning to falter. She had fought the town, the sheriff, the judge, and she had won. But it was a hollow victory. The pressure of the town's silent, suffocating judgment was relentless. The loneliness she had once known as a dull ache had returned as a sharp, piercing agony, made worse now because she knew the comfort of its absence. She tried to reach for Eli, to break through the wall he had built around himself, but her words fell into the empty space between them and died. The town delivered its final message that night. They were sitting in near total darkness, the fire unlit, the silence between them as vast and cold as the night outside. The first sign of trouble was the sudden, frantic clucking of the hens, a sound of pure terror that was cut short abruptly. Eli was on his feet in an instant, the lifelessness in his eyes replaced by a sharp, feral alertness. Then came the smell of smoke, not the familiar, comforting smell of a wood fire, but the sharp, acrid scent of kerosene. A flickering, orange light danced outside the single window. "Get down," Eli hissed, shoving her toward the floor. A rock shattered the window pane, and a moment later, a torch, a rag-wrapped stick soaked in fuel and aflame, was tossed inside. It landed on her cot, and the dry ticking and thin blanket erupted in a whoosh of fire. In the sudden, terrible light, she could see the silhouettes of at least a half-dozen men outside, their faces obscured by the darkness and the flames. They were not a lynch mob. Not yet. They were simply delivering a verdict. Eli moved with a speed that defied his broken spirit. He grabbed the half-full water bucket and doused the flames on the cot, but it was too late. Another torch crashed through the open doorway, landing in a pile of firewood and kindling. The dry wood caught instantly, and the fire roared to life, licking its way up the log walls. Smoke, thick and black, began to fill the small cabin, choking them. We have to go," Eli yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the back of the cabin. There was no back door, only the small, crude window he had repaired. He kicked out the frame with 2 powerful blows, sending wood and dried mud flying into the night. "Go, now," he ordered, pushing her toward the opening. She scrambled through, her dress catching on a splinter, the rough wood scraping her hands. She fell to the ground outside, coughing, her lungs burning. Eli was right behind her. As she looked back, she saw the cabin she had called home for a year, her prison and her sanctuary, being consumed by a hungry, roaring inferno. The roof caught, and a shower of sparks erupted into the night sky like 1,000 angry stars. The men who had done it were already melting back into the darkness, their work done. They had nothing. Her savings had been spent. The few possessions she owned were turning to ash, and the town had made it clear there was no place for them there. They had only Eli's horse, his saddlebag, and the clothes on their backs. With nowhere else to go, they fled. Eli helped her onto the horse, then swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. She leaned back against the solid wall of his chest, her body trembling with shock and grief. He spurred the horse not toward the town, but away from it, up into the dark, silent hills that loomed over the valley. They rode for hours, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the hateful glow in the sky behind them. They finally stopped in a small, sheltered clearing, surrounded by a stand of tall pines. Eli slid from the horse and helped her down. Her legs were unsteady, and she stumbled, collapsing onto the cold, pine needle-covered ground. The dam of her composure finally broke, and she began to sob. Not with the quiet, dignified tears of before, but with harsh, ragged gasps of pure despair. Everything was gone. Eli built a small, smokeless fire, his movements economical and grim. He sat across from her, the firelight casting deep shadows on his bruised face. He did not try to comfort her with words. He simply sat there, a silent, watchful guardian in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. For 2 days, they lived a feral existence. Eli hunted, bringing back a rabbit that they cooked over the fire. They found a small, clear stream to drink from. They slept on the cold ground, wrapped in his single saddle blanket, close but not touching, the silence between them a chasm of unspoken grief and fear. Clara felt herself sinking, the will to go on draining out of her with each passing hour. The town had won. They had burned away her last vestiges of hope. On the 3rd night, the cold was a living thing. It seeped into their bones, a damp, relentless chill that the small fire could not keep at bay. They sat huddled under the blanket, their shoulders pressed together for warmth. Clara was shivering, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that shook her entire body. Eli shifted, turning to face her. In the flickering firelight, his eyes were full of a terrible, aching guilt. "This is my fault," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "All of it. I should have kept riding. I never should have stopped at your door." "No," she said, her teeth chattering. "It is not your fault. It is theirs. It is this place." She looked at him, at his broken face, at the profound despair in his eyes, and she saw a reflection of her own hopelessness. They were 2 embers, burning down to ash. She did not know what moved her. It was not thought. It was a deeper, more primal instinct, a desperate, defiant need to feel something other than cold and fear, a need to prove that the fire that had taken her home had not taken everything. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his cheek. He flinched, but did not pull away. He closed his eyes, a shudder passing through him. His skin was cold. "Clara," he breathed, a warning and a plea in one. She leaned forward and pressed her cold lips against his. The kiss was clumsy, desperate, tasting of smoke and sorrow. For a moment, he remained perfectly still, frozen. Then, with a low groan that seemed to be torn from the depths of his soul, he responded. His arms came around her, pulling her against him, and his mouth met hers with a fierce, desperate hunger that matched her own. This was not the gentle, questioning kiss from her dream. This was something else entirely. It was a raw, frantic collision of two people clinging to each other in the dark, seeking not pleasure but affirmation, seeking proof that they were still alive. He laid her down gently on the bed of pine needles, his body shielding hers from the cold night air. His hands were rough, his touch urgent, but there was a current of profound tenderness beneath the desperation. Every touch was a question, every movement a search for comfort. This was not about desire alone. It was an act of survival, a desperate prayer against the darkness, a longing for a human connection that might somehow survive the ashes of their lives. As he moved to touch her more intimately, she stiffened, a lifetime of fear and pain rising up in her like a physical barrier. A phantom ache bloomed in her ribs, a memory of Robert's hands, of touch that was a weapon, not a comfort. Tears welled in her eyes, hot against her cold skin. Eli felt her tremble, saw the fear in her eyes. He stopped instantly. He pulled back, his face a mask of shame and self-loathing. "I am sorry," he whispered, his voice ragged. "I am sorry. Clara, I would never—" "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. She reached up, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him back down to her. "Do not stop." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears in the firelight, and she gave him the one truth that mattered, the truth that would define them. "It still hurts," she said, her voice a raw, ragged whisper. "But I want more." The words were a confession and a plea, an acknowledgement of all the pain she had carried and a defiant choice to reach for something better. It was the bravest thing she had ever said. Something broke in his face then. The guilt, the despair, it all washed away, replaced by a look of such profound, reverent tenderness that it took her breath away. He understood. He understood that she was not just talking about the ghosts of her past, but about the risk of a future, the pain of hope itself. He held her then, not as a lover taking, but as a man making a vow. He held her as if she were the last ember in a dying world, and his only purpose was to keep her safe, to shelter her from the wind. He promised her a tomorrow that neither of them had ever dared to dream of, not with words, but with the gentle, patient reverence of his touch. He promised it with the way he held her through the long, cold night, a silent, unbreakable vow in the flickering firelight. In the days that followed, a quiet peace settled over them. In the vast, silent wilderness, they were finally free. There were no judging eyes, no cruel whispers, only the sigh of the wind in the pines, the crackle of the fire, and the steady, comforting presence of each other. For the first time, they were not a widow and an outlaw. They were just Clara and Eli. They worked together, gathering wood, foraging for berries, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. They found a new kind of intimacy in the simple, shared tasks of survival, a deeper connection than they had ever known in the cabin. They were a world of two, and in that small, fragile world, they found an unexpected and profound peace. But their sanctuary was a temporary one. The nights grew colder, the wind carrying the first sharp bite of winter. The leaves on the aspens turned from green to brilliant, trembling gold, and then fell, leaving the branches bare and skeletal against a steel-gray sky. Food became harder to find. The peace they had found was slowly being eroded by the grim, practical realities of survival. Clara, who had lived her life indoors, was not built for this kind of hardship. The constant cold, the lack of proper food, the nights spent sleeping on the hard ground, it all began to take its toll. It started with a cough, a dry, racking sound that echoed in the quiet woods. Then came the fever. At first, it was low, a simple flush on her cheeks. But within 2 days, it had taken hold, leaving her weak and shivering, her skin burning hot to the touch. She would drift in and out of a delirious sleep, muttering names and phrases Eli did not understand. He did what he could. He kept the fire blazing. He wrapped her in their only blanket. He trickled cool water from the stream between her parched lips. But she was getting worse. The fever was burning through her, and he knew, with a cold, sickening certainty, that if he did not do something, he would lose her. Winter came early that year. The first snow began to fall. Not a gentle dusting, but thick, heavy flakes that quickly blanketed the ground in a layer of white. The world became silent, muffled, and beautiful in its deadly embrace. Eli looked down at Clara's pale, still face, and he knew he had no choice. There were small outposts and trading posts scattered through these hills, places where a man could get supplies, medicine. But it meant leaving her. It meant riding for miles through the snow, alone. He banked the fire, piled a mountain of firewood beside her, and tucked the blanket tightly around her. He knelt beside her, his hand brushing the damp hair from her forehead. "I will be back." "Clara?" he whispered, his voice thick. "I promise you, I will not leave you unfinished." He rode out into the swirling snow, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. For 2 days he pushed on, the snow getting deeper, the wind a constant, biting whip against his face. He was about to give up hope when he saw it through the trees, the faint, yellow glow of a lamp in a window. It was a small, ramshackle trading post, a collection of 3 rough-hewn buildings huddled in a narrow valley, a lifeline in the frozen wilderness. He tied his weary horse to the rail and pushed his way through the door, a blast of cold air following him in. The room was warm, smelling of wood smoke, whiskey, and wet wool. 3 men sat at a table playing cards. The man behind the crude bar looked up, his expression wary. Eli's eyes swept the room, and then they froze. Sitting at the card table, his back to the door, was a man whose profile he knew better than his own. It was a face he had seen every night in his dreams, a face he had sworn to see one last time before he died. He was heavier now, with a thick beard, but there was no mistaking the cruel set of his jaw, the arrogant tilt of his head. He was laughing, a deep, rumbling sound as he laid his cards down on the table. "Read them and weep, boys," the man said. "The name's Abernathy, and it seems my luck is holding." Silas Blackwood, hiding in plain sight, under a new name, in a place where he thought no one would ever find him. The man who had burned his life to the ground was sitting 10 feet away, and Eli stood between him and the medicine that was the only hope for the woman who had become his world. The past had finally caught up with the present. For a single, frozen moment, the world narrowed to the 10 feet of space inside the trading post. The air, thick with the smell of whiskey and wood smoke, seemed to turn to ice in Eli's lungs. At the table, Silas Blackwood laughed again, oblivious, a ghost from a past that had just become terrifyingly present. Behind Eli was the howling snow and a dying woman. In front of him was the man who had destroyed his life. The need for vengeance, a fire he had banked for years, roared to life, hot and savage. But another, newer fire burned just as fiercely, the promise he had made to Clara. He turned away from the card table, his movements stiff, his face a granite mask. He walked to the bar, every instinct screaming at him to draw his gun, to end it right there, but the promise held him. "I will be back. Clara." "I need medicine," he said to the wary-eyed bartender, his voice a low rasp. "Anything you have for a fever. Laudanum, quinine, whatever you have." The bartender gave him a long, searching look, then nodded toward a dusty shelf behind him. "Got some patent fever powders. Cost you $2. Eli's hand went to the small pouch inside his coat. As he pulled out the coins, he felt Blackwood's eyes on his back. A predator's instinct. A man like Blackwood would notice a stranger, especially one who moved with the coiled tension Eli could not hide. "You are new here," a voice drawled from the table. It was deep, laced with a false heartiness that Eli remembered with a visceral hatred. Eli did not turn. He dropped the coins on the bar, his gaze fixed on the bartender. "Just passing through." He took the small tin of powders, his fingers closing around it like a talisman. It was all that mattered. He had to get back to her. Justice could wait. Clara could not. He turned to leave, keeping his face angled away from the table, his eyes on the door. "Hold on there, friend," Blackwood said, the amusement gone from his voice, replaced by a sharp edge of suspicion. "I know you from somewhere." Eli's hand rested on the door latch. He could feel Blackwood standing up, the scrape of his chair loud in the suddenly silent room. The promise. The medicine. Clara's pale face. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the swirling blizzard. He had made it 2 steps toward his horse when the door of the trading post flew open behind him. "You!" Blackwood roared, his voice cutting through the wind. "The basin! The fire! You are James's brother!" Eli turned slowly. The snow was coming down so thick it was like a white curtain between them. Through it, he could see the silhouette of Silas Blackwood, a gun already in his hand. The other men from the post were crowded in the doorway, their faces pale smudges in the lamplight. There was no choice now. The past would not be postponed. Eli's hand went to his own gun, the worn leather of the grip familiar and cold against his palm. He thought of Clara, alone in the wilderness, and a cold, clear certainty settled over him. He would not die here. Blackwood fired first, a flash of orange in the white gloom. The shot went wide, the sound swallowed by the snow. Eli did not fire back. He dove to the side, behind a stack of cordwood. The tin of medicine clutched tight in his left hand. The wood splintered as another bullet tore into it. This would not be a duel on a dusty street. This was an execution, and he was the intended victim. Blackwood was a lawman gone rotten. He had no honor, only a killer's instinct. He would use the cover of the storm, the confusion, to put a bullet in Eli's back. Eli waited, his breathing steady, the world slowing down around him. He could hear Blackwood's heavy footsteps crunching in the snow, circling around the woodpile. He was trying to flank him. Eli stayed low, pressing himself against the frozen logs. He held his gun, but his mind was on the small tin in his other hand. It had to survive. He carefully slipped it deep into the inner pocket of his coat. He heard a crunch of snow directly behind him. He spun, firing as he moved. A grunt of pain told him he had hit his mark, but it was not Blackwood. It was one of the other card players. A man who had chosen the wrong side, who now lay clutching his leg in the snow. Blackwood used the distraction. He lunged out of the white curtain of the storm, no longer trying to shoot, but to overwhelm. He was bigger than Eli remembered, a bear of a man, and he crashed into Eli with the force of a runaway freight wagon. They went down in a tangle of limbs, the gun flying from Eli's hand, skittering away into the deep snow. The fight was brutal. Primal. It was not a fight of skill, but of pure, desperate hatred. They rolled in the snow, grunting, fists landing with dull, wet thuds. Blackwood was stronger, his weight pinning Eli down. His hands closed around Eli's throat, his thumbs pressing down, cutting off his air. Eli's vision began to sparkle with black spots. He clawed at Blackwood's face, his fingers finding the man's eyes. Blackwood roared in pain and rage, loosening his grip just enough for Eli to suck in a ragged gasp of air. Eli drove his knee up hard into Blackwood's groin. The big man howled, his body arching in agony. Eli shoved him off, scrambling to his feet, searching wildly for his gun. He could not see it. Blackwood was already getting up, a long skinning knife now in his hand, its blade a dark sliver against the snow. He came at Eli, his face a twisted mask of fury, the knife held low. Eli backed away, his boots slipping in the snow. His back came up against the rough wall of the trading post. He was cornered. Blackwood lunged, the knife arcing toward Eli's gut. Eli twisted, the blade slicing through his thick coat and deep into his side, just below his ribs. A hot, searing pain exploded through him. It was the same spot where he had been shot before. a geography of pain his body knew all too well. He cried out, a raw, animal sound. But as the blade went in, he grabbed Blackwood's wrist with both hands, stopping the killing thrust. They were locked together, face to face, their breath misting in the freezing air. Blackwood's eyes were wide with bloodlust, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "I should have killed you with your brother," he snarled. That was the last thing he ever said. A white-hot rage, forged in the fire that had taken his family, gave Eli a strength he did not know he possessed. He ignored the fire in his side. He thought of James's face, of Clara's, and he pushed. With a final, guttural roar, he drove Blackwood backward, using the man's own momentum against him. He slammed Blackwood's head against the log wall of the trading post. Once, twice, the third time, there was a sickening crack, and Blackwood's body went limp, sliding down the wall to sit in a heap in the snow, his eyes open and staring sightlessly at the storm. Justice, finally, was served. It was not clean or noble. It was ugly and bloody, and it had cost him dearly. Eli stood over the body, swaying, his hand pressed to the gushing wound in his side. Blood, dark and hot, stained the pure white snow around him. He looked at the men in the doorway, who were staring at him with a mixture of terror and awe. Then he turned, found his gun, and stumbled toward his horse. He had a promise to keep. The ride back was a fever dream. The pain in his side was a constant, throbbing fire. The world was a blur of white snow and black trees. More than once, he nearly fell from the saddle, his vision tunneling, his mind drifting. The only thing that kept him going was her name. A single word he repeated over and over like a prayer. Clara, Clara, Clara. He did not know how long he rode. A day. 2. He finally found the sheltered clearing, guided by some instinct he did not know he had. The fire was nothing but a pile of gray ash. Clara was a still, small shape under the snow-dusted blanket. For one terrible, heart-stopping moment, he thought he was too late. He fell from his horse, crawling the last few feet to her side. He touched her cheek. It was cold, but beneath the surface cold, there was still a flicker of warmth. She was alive, barely. He fumbled in his coat, his fingers clumsy and slick with his own blood, and pulled out the small tin of powders. He mixed them with melted snow and gently, painstakingly, trickled the bitter liquid between her lips. For the next week, he existed in a haze of pain and fear. He tended to her, and he tended to his own crude, stitched-up wound. He kept the fire blazing. He hunted when he could, his movements slow and agonizing. He fed her broth and the fever medicine, watching, waiting. He would drift into a light, pain-filled sleep and wake with a start, his hand immediately going to her forehead to check for the fever. Slowly, miraculously, it began to recede. The color began to return to her cheeks. One morning, he woke to find her eyes open, and she was looking at him. Her gaze was weak, but it was clear. She had survived, and in saving her, he had saved himself. Spring came late that year, but when it came with a fierce, life-affirming beauty. The snow melted, the streams swelled, and the hillsides exploded in a riot of green and yellow wildflowers. As Clara's strength returned, so did their resolve. They would not spend the rest of their lives hiding in the hills like scared animals. They rode back into Bridger's Fork not on a day of judgment, but on a quiet Tuesday morning. The town was the same, dusty and tired, but they were different. They rode side by side, their backs straight, their gazes fixed forward. They were not afraid anymore. Their first stop was the office of Judge Finch. He looked up as they entered, and a rare, genuine smile touched his lips. His investigation had borne more fruit than they could have hoped. The death of Silas Blackwood had unraveled a web of corruption that stretched all the way back to the Colorado Territory, and it had implicated Sheriff Brody, who had indeed taken money to see Eli captured or killed. That afternoon, the judge stood on the steps of the sheriff's office and spoke to the small crowd that had gathered. He publicly cleared Eli's name, telling the true story of the Tonto Basin Range War and the crimes of Deputy Marshal Silas Blackwood. He then produced evidence of Sheriff Brody's corruption. The sheriff, disgraced and exposed, had fled town the night before, a fugitive from the very law he had sworn to uphold. Clara's own reckoning was a quieter affair. She saw the women who had shunned her standing in a tight, whispering knot near the church. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, all of them, leaving Eli with the judge. She walked toward them. She did not speak. She did not need to. She simply stood before them, her gaze level, her face calm and proud. She was not the broken, pathetic creature they had tried to make her. She was a survivor. Some of them could not meet her eyes, lowering their heads in shame. Others, seeing the strength and forgiveness in her face, a grace they had denied her, began to weep. It was not an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, a silent admission of their own cruelty. With the help of Judge Finch, who felt a deep, abiding guilt for his earlier neglect, Clara was granted a parcel of land further west, in a fertile valley where the river ran clear and the trees grew tall. It was compensation, the judge said, for the loss of her home and her good name. It was a chance to start over. They rode out of Bridger's Fork 2 weeks later, heading west into the setting sun. They did not look back. Their new life was built with their own hands. They felled trees and raised a small, sturdy cabin, its windows facing the sunrise. Eli cleared the land, and Clara planted a garden. They acquired a milk cow and more chickens. It was a hard life, a life of sweat and calluses and aching muscles. But it was their life. They found their solace not in the perfection of their new home, but in its resilience and in their own. They found it in the quiet moments, in the trust that grew between them, steady and strong as the pines on the ridge. They found it in the way he would come in from the fields, tired and covered in dust, and his eyes would find hers across the room. A silent conversation passing between them that needed no words. And they found it in the way he still touched her scars, the faded one on her arm from Robert, the new ones on her hands from the fire. He would trace them with his fingertips, not with pity, but with a reverence that felt like prayer. He was not trying to heal them. He was honoring them, acknowledging them as part of the story that had brought her to him. One evening, as the first chill of autumn settled in the valley, they sat by the fire, wrapped together in a thick wool blanket. The flames danced, casting a warm, golden glow across their faces. A log shifted, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and Clara's hand, resting on her lap, began to tremble. It was a ghost, a deep, cellular memory of fear that still surfaced from time to time, a tremor from the fault line of her past. Eli's hand, calloused and strong, came to cover hers. His warmth seeped into her, steadying her, chasing away the phantom chill. He did not speak, did not ask. He just held her hand, a silent, anchoring presence. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes closing as she felt the last of the tremor subside. She turned her head, her lips close to his ear, and whispered the two words that held the past, the present, and all of their tomorrows. "Don't stop." He tightened his grip on her hand, a firm, reassuring pressure. He looked into the fire, at the future they were building together from the ashes, and his voice was a low, unbreakable vow in the quiet of the room. "I never will." Thank you for listening to our story. Comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and share your thoughts in English.